Welcome to the third week of the 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit. Thank you for joining us. I'm coming to you from Seattle, the ancestral and unceded land of the Duwamish and the coastal Salish. The Shared Use Mobility Center is headquartered in Chicago, located on the traditional and unceded lands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes or nations. I'm Benjamin de la Peña, and I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. For the benefit of our visually impaired participants, let me describe how I appear on the screen. I'm a middle-aged Asian man with brown skin and short black hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and a white shirt. So the summit is virtual and distributed. We'll see you today and one more Tuesday this July. And don't forget our last Thursday Echo event this week, featuring our Mobility Justice Spotlight. I'd like to take a moment to thank Uber and all of our sponsors for supporting this event. We couldn't do this without your generous support. As you know, the theme of this summit is the big shift. And as I've said at the start of every Tuesday this month, the scene behind me, and for those visually impaired, it's a moving video of a highway. The scene behind me is exactly what we need to change. It's the I-5 highway in Seattle. It was built to move thousands of cars running on fossil fuels. It was rammed through the First Hill, a historically Black neighborhood, and the Chinatown International District. It displaced families and severed deep social ties. It devalued property and shuttered businesses. The pollution it generates disproportionately affects Black and brown children and households. The I-5 running through the heart of the city is literally structural racism, injustice cast in concrete, and part of the vast infrastructure that has precipitated the climate crisis. What that infrastructure represents is a lack of choices. What that infrastructure represents is a set of dysfunctional relationships, broken and extractive economic relationships, broken neighborhood ties, a devaluing of communities because of race, and a broken relationship with our environment and the planet. You can fill this highway with electric cars, but it still won't solve the inefficiency of moving 1 or 2 people in 2-ton vehicles. It still won't work for 17% of the population who can't afford to own cars, most of them Black and brown households. We need more shared mobility that works for everyone, that connects rather than disconnects. This is the conversation that drives the content of the summit. We need the big shift. So in our summit, we don't have keynotes. We have key conversations. We want people to talk to each other, not talk at each other. You'll notice too that we don't have moderators. We have hosts. Our hosts have the power to choose who they want to talk to and what they want to talk about. Our 2 hosts for this particular Tuesday, are Naomi Dorner from Nelson Nygaard and one of the conveners of Untokening, and Dr. Beverly Scott, CEO of Beverly Scott Associates and founder of Introducing Youth to American Infrastructure, Inc. Naomi leads the conversation this morning. Dr. Scott leads the afternoon session. In between and after, we'll have breakout panels. So please check out the list on the links to the left of your screen and also participate in the chats to the right of the screen. There's also a networking tab on FeedLoop, which is our platform, the platform we're using, that you can set up virtual meetings with other participants. After each key conversation, join us in the virtual expo hall and visit the expo booths. One more thing, we won't spend much time introducing the panelists. Their bios are available on the event website if you need it. So let me not take up more of your time and pass you over to the host of our first key conversation today, Naomi Dorner. Naomi?
Hi, thanks so much to Benji and to everyone at the Shared Use Mobility Center. We are so grateful to be here today. I am going to do very, very brief frame up, but I think Benji did a wonderful job really setting this conversation. When Benji approached me about being a host for this conversation, I thought about, who has been really influential both in my thinking as well as the work and the way that I have been, actively framing the work throughout, especially the last 6 to 7 years of my career and time doing transportation equity and mobility justice work. And the people that came to mind were my colleague and friend, Dr. Adonia Lugo, as well as Hannah Krieger, who we'll hear from in just a moment. And it was really compelling, the idea of having a conversation about the things that are on my mind, on our mind, conversations that are not just percolating, but I think really finding their way into the mainstream, which, 5 to 6 years ago, I think if anyone would have told me that there would have been a pillar inside of USDOT named mobility justice, I would have been like taken aback, and I would not have thought that would even be possible. And so for that to be the case today, it just made me realize that there's so much opportunity, and there's still a real need, right, for us to continue to define what we mean, because mobility justice is an intersection of all of these different experiences, different realities, and it is evolving. And so for me, the conversation today, and what I'm really wanting to get into, is what it means for us now and going forward into futures, transportation and mobility futures, to have a just transition. And we'll talk about what that means, and then specifically what it means in terms of transportation and mobility justice, and what it actually can look like. I think that's also just as important as the concept itself. But first, I will say that, I forgot to do this, but my name is Naomi Dorner. I'm with Nelson Nygaard. I'm the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am seated currently in Duwamish lands, but I do currently in Seattle, but I do live in Oakland on Ohlone land. So I'm working a little remotely at the moment, and I am wearing a pink shirt with a white sweater and dangly gold earrings for your viewing appeal, and they're quite nice. And then I've got curly hair, and that is how I would describe myself. So I'm going to pass it over to Adonia to talk a little about her work and relationship to transportation, equity, mobility, justice, and then do her intro as well.
Great. Thanks, Naomi. Great to be here this morning from Tongva Land, Los Angeles. Good to be in conversation with Naomi and Hannah, and thanks to Benji and Hannah for the behind the scenes support. I'm Adonia Lugo. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a woman with short dark hair. I'm wearing a big old headset thing, and I have on a brown blouse and little overshirt. And I do have dangly earrings, but they're not as prominent as Naomi's. She's really overshadowing me right now with her dangle. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. I will be returning to Antioch University, Los Angeles in mid-August. Currently, I'm out on maternity leave, been in babyland since February. And so for me, this is my first back to Zoom conversation. So my apologies if I'm a little scattered, but I'm excited to be dipping back in. So as Naomi mentioned, we have been colleagues in developing the mobility justice conversation for a number of years now. For us, it was an outgrowth of witnessing a reluctance to shift and transition in the active transportation space, where we had been, working around equity and diversity issues earlier in the teens. And so we created, along with a number of other individuals, this project called the Untokening in 2016. And the mobility justice concept then emerged from that space, which you can see in the name Untokening. Our focus was really around having an opportunity for those of us who had experienced feeling like we weren't really there to be allowed to substantively contribute to a conversation, giving us the space to come out of that token role and really formulate, what did we see as our vision for mobility and things like that. And so mobility justice, is what we started to call that. And we created a document from our first gathering in 2016 called the 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice. Something very exciting with that document is it got translated into Spanish last year by a group of Latin American collaborators. So it's been really neat to see how something that, for us was a product of collective voice go on to have an impact and a life in other spaces beyond, where it came from. And to shift over to talking about the just transition concept, I'm going to see if I remember how to share my screen. Okay, here we are. We're just on the wrong slide. That's not the worst thing. Now I'm going to go to full screen. Can I get a nod that y'all are seeing a full screen slide? Excellent. So the concept of the just transition is something that I came into contact with through a colleague of mine at Antioch University a few years ago, and I know a growing number of us are seeing this in practice in climate justice spaces and allied movements. And the basic idea here is giving us a framework for looking at, well, what is it that needs to change? A lot of us have recognized in the field of transportation and mobility, and in many fields, that we just keep running into some walls, both in terms of what Benji was talking about at the beginning with this infrastructure paradigm that is very car-centered, very, focused on the right of a lone person to travel in several tons of metal. We know that that's an issue, right? But then we also have this issue around the lingering effects of a segregated society. So there are multiple kinds of walls that we're running into around how to actually shift our fields so that they are inclusive not only of multiple modes, right, but also of multiple experiences. And so for folks in the mobility justice space, I think, we've been very inspired by the work done by disability justice advocates in particular to point out, the fact that when people with different kinds of needs are left out of the conversation, you're not going to get to a solution that actually works for everybody. And so what we need to do is, as a starting point, really create more of a sense of a collective that we can all be part of. So with that kind of in mind, looking at the just transition concept, what's useful in my mind about this, and I guess I should narrate a little bit what's on the slide here, is, this is saying currently, in many ways, both in our jobs and our personal lives and how we live, we are just locked into this extractive economic model. The way that we buy things, use things, where our waste goes, how our collective resources are spent, who controls them, all that kind of stuff. It's built on extraction. What we would like to get to, what a growing number of us would like to get to, is actually a regenerative system where the ways that we live and the ways that we interact with both each other as people, with the natural world, our resources, that kind of thing, shift to having more of a sense of cooperation and a material basis of being regenerative built into it. So this is kind of like the big picture of the just transition framework, which was developed by this particular model was developed by the Climate Justice Alliance in partnership with a group called Movement Generation, which is based up in the Oakland Bay area. So I'm going to just zoom in a little bit on one part of this framework. So again, if we want to identify what the extractive practices are that are harming our communities, our planet, all that kind of stuff, and then shift to regenerative practices that are going to do the opposite, that are actually going to care for, not treat things as throwaway. If we take this idea and apply it to transportation and mobility, where does that take us? And so for me and for Naomi and for a lot of other folks I know, there's a lot of resonance in using this kind of a question as a way to guide, what do we think mobility justice should look like? And the last thing I want to say is something that's been really key for my thinking in the last few years, in part because of the just transition model, is shifting from looking at equity as something that has to do with just having a voice. I know that in a lot of planning spaces, we have this baseline history of exclusion in terms of whose idea of what a street should look like, whose idea of what a city should look like has been imposed on pretty much everybody else. So we know that there's inequity in terms of who, gets to have a say, who's at the table. But we actually need to go a lot deeper and look at equity in the sense of who has an ownership stake in terms of who's going to be able to stay in neighborhoods, what kind of jobs are they going to have, what are we designing, and one of the major challenges that I've seen, and I know others have seen in the last few years around a sharing economy or various kinds of new mobility industries is, unfortunately, there's not a good place for workers in those industries. The people who actually provide the mobility services are increasingly treated like something that needs to be eliminated and replaced with automation. They've not been the focus, and really, there's one thing I want to get across today. It's that we can't have a mobility justice future if we don't actually include working families in what we're talking about. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And should I pass it over to Hannah or back to you, Naomi?
No, back to Hannah. Hannah, if you want to give us, your intro and how and what your relationship is personally and professionally to transportation and mobility justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Hannah Krieger, Senior Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute. Really happy to be here with you all. I use she, her pronouns. I'm on Ohlone land in Berkeley. I'm a woman with brown hair and a velvet gray top. I also got some fun dangly earrings. And for those who are not familiar, Greenlining is a research and public policy nonprofit advocating for racial equity, really with the goal of improving opportunities and a better quality of life for low-income communities of color. I'd say my specific focus bucket world of work is all things clean mobility, but we do not take a prescriptive approach, especially as a grass tops organization. Greenlining is not in the business of telling communities which mobility options are best for them. That's not our role, that's not appropriate. We are mode as agnostic, as long as it's clean and as long as it's developed and deployed in a way that is equitable. And I'd say that kind of perfectly encapsulates my approach and passion around mobility. I want to contribute to creating policies and programs that are centered around addressing community identified needs and that foster community power to make those decisions on their own, right? And so in the context of kind of a just transition in transportation, I think we're all really excited about this kind of energy around mobility justice at the local, state, and now federal level. And, while there's this potential influx of new federal dollars for these kinds of clean mobility projects and programs, just one thing I want to make sure we're all thinking about is how do we ensure that the folks who actually are the ones to win out on all these dollars are not just the electric vehicle companies, shared mobility companies. How can we really take advantage of this moment as an opportunity to upend the status quo that created these environmental and transportation injustices in the first place? And we can't continue this business as usual approach. We have to fundamentally transform the way that we even do transportation planning and decision making, as well as the implementation of projects, the evaluation of them. We need to center equity and community power at every step of the way. And I can share many more examples of how we can start to do that later on.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the part that I really want to dig into and have us all kind of discuss is, this notion of, I think that in transportation equity and as it is in the sector now, and the way that it's being discussed or beginning to be discussed in some cases, is exactly to Adonia's point, oh, here's what we did wrong, here's what not to do, and let's make sure that we're bringing more voices to the table. And that is really just the beginning of what this framework is about, because ultimately, for a just transition to work and for mobility justice, right, to transpire, we know that it really is about community empowerment. It is about, self-determined solutions. And so I'm really interested in digging more into what that looks like, what that will feel like, and what that is practically on the ground. Because I know there are so many examples. We have the benefit, I will just say that, of being in California, where I think that, as the saying goes, I'm in California, so the rest will follow, or whatever that saying is. And I do think there are some really great models, not just here, but I know of some here. And so I guess I'm curious, especially in the cooperative, right, thinking, because I know that so much of this work, and when we're talking about just transition, it is about collectivism. It is about cooperatism. It is not about corporate gains and just the bottom line. It is about how the community, again, from a regenerative perspective, is really benefiting from their own solutions, right? Their own, their own ideas, their own ability to create, like realities and futures that are going to work. So let's talk about that. Anyone want to jump in?
I'd be happy to share a few examples and some tools as well that really are trying to move us towards that model of community self-determination. So I would say the first that I'd want to cover, and I'm going to drop this into the chat, make sure it goes to everyone, is Greenlining's mobility equity framework. So this is an equitable planning and decision-making tool that offers 3 really simple steps. First, conduct a community mobility needs assessment and ask folks to brainstorm ideas to meet those needs. Second, conduct an equity analysis that compares those ideas using equity indicators and metrics that reflect community values and priorities. And then third, with the results of that analysis, ask the community to vote on which mobility options to fund and implement. And it's funny because it's like, this is not very radical. It's a very simple process of centering community self-determination at every step of the way, but it does run counter to how these mobility decisions are traditionally made. So that part is a little radical, right? And right now, the mobility equity framework has been implemented or adapted across a variety of contexts in San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, Portland, San Diego, and to several state of California grant programs. And this tool could also be utilized in addition to just by cities, but by mobility companies, but also by communities wanting to do their own planning. Now, what I just covered, that's an example of like an equitable planning and decision-making tool, which has to be done before the mobility investments are made. And that piece is critical, right? But it also is important, like what happens after that. And that's why I want to share Greenlining's Clean Mobility Equity Playbook, which I'm also dropping into the chat right now. So this playbook offers a wealth of case studies of the implementation of community-driven and in some cases community-owned clean mobility equity programs and infrastructure. All of the examples in this playbook are specifically targeted to low-income folks of color across urban, suburban, and rural regions of California. So we conducted an equity evaluation of 12 of these mobility programs and outlined their best practices, their challenges, there are a lot of them, their lessons learned, and their recommendations. So I would say these equity evaluation, it was really centered around our 6 standards for equitable investment, which are emphasize anti-racist solutions, prioritize multi-sector approaches, deliver intentional benefits, build community capacity, be community-driven at every stage, and establish paths towards wealth building. And obviously, like, those are topics that don't necessarily have an explicit mobility focus, but that's exactly the point, right? Because traditional mobility measures are failing us. They fail to deliver on equity because they don't look at it in a comprehensive way. And so, I hope that, as local, state, federal governments are gaining this energy around equity and momentum, I hope that, these resources to advance mobility equity can be useful in helping to expand our minds beyond just like the traditional measures of access and affordability, right? Because in my mind, I think these kind of community-driven, community-owned models of clean mobilities, like that's the real innovation in my mind. Like, I'm sorry, a car driving itself, like that is cool, don't get me wrong. I've been in a self-driving car, but like I don't think that's the innovation we necessarily need right now. I think we need a restructuring of kind of power and decision-making. The last thing I'll mention is how are we going to pay for mobility justice? A just transition cannot rely on the same old models of extractive, inequitable dollars like gas taxes and sales taxes. We need funding mechanisms that are more, regenerative, equitable, that actually reduce emissions and are sustainable in the long run. And we have to make sure those dollars get to the right communities, and then the communities have the capacity to sustain those programs. And so the very last link I'm dropping into the chat, I promise, is our Sustaining Clean Mobility Equity Programs report, which offers an array of equitable funding structures, how to maintain them and sustain them.
Thanks so much for all those resources. And yeah, I guess, Adonia, I'm curious with like the way that we had originally, and I know again it's evolving, when we intentionally named the mobility justice principles the 1.0 version, because we knew that it would evolve and grow and wanted to create that space for that iteration. But the way that we sort of framed the principles was like stating the problem, kind of noting what the principle was that the community we had engaged with, at the time, the collective, stated, like surfacing that, and then what the practice was. And I think one of the big ones that came out of it in the principles was really prioritizing people over profit, property, or placemaking. And as we're talking about, this model, a just transition, I'm curious, like how you're seeing, is the principle just evolving? Are we in a place where we're seeing that happen? And what if we're going to prioritize people, but we also want them to benefit economically? There is a piece of it that is about profit. And so I'm just curious, like I've been really grappling with that one personally, and I'm like, we want profit, but it's more than dollars, right? It's like how the community itself and how the people who have been extracted from are actually thriving, right? From these sort of emerging markets, opportunities, and so on. So I don't know if there's anything there you want to speak to, or anything else within our framework, and just collective examples you've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you that there's a sort of nice ideal of, oh, we're going to really make things oriented around community, not individual profit. And then there's the very stark reality of wealth inequality, right? And how it is a racialized issue, and how for so many, Black families, Latinx families, not even, let's also talk about Indigenous peoples, right? The theft of land and bodies and the pressures that have led to people, ending up where they are. And then now the gentrification cycles that people have gone through. There is, I think some folks are ready to talk about community empowerment that has to do with less of a focus on kind of like what's my way that I'm going to profit. But for a lot of people, just figuring out how to stabilize their family economic situation is a really big priority that's going to happen first. And some of the ways I see that playing out in Los Angeles is around things like house flipping. So from my perspective, house flipping is flipping awful, like we're taking these homes that maybe somebody couldn't afford to keep it up very well, and then they sell it in a hurry, and then somebody else comes in and does some repair work and then sells it for a really inflated price. So I'm seeing homes in my neighborhood that are 100 years old, not in that great a shape, being sold for like $1 million. And to me, that's just a despicable practice. I hate it. But then if you look at who is doing that house flipping, I see a lot of discourse and narrative on social media about how, Black companies getting in on that or being the house flippers. That's a way to build, your family's wealth, that sort of thing. So that's one example, where we have, here we are, part of being in this extractive economy and set of social relationships is that there's a whole lot of people who have been kept down. I don't think we're going to be able to totally skip the part where people participate in those extractive practices in order to feel like they have some stability. I don't think we're going to be able to just say, and I feel this way about the whole sustainability discourse in general, like, okay, those of us who've gotten to consume as much as we want have now decided nobody should be doing that. Okay, so developing countries, y'all aren't going to live that way. We all just need to move on. I don't really think we're going to, that something's wrong about that, right? Like, just because if we're the ones with the privilege who've been able to benefit the most from this extractive model, we don't then get to decide for everybody that, we're done with it, right? And I hate that. I hate it so much, but I think that that's also true. It doesn't feel right to me. So another example in my experience of that tension and set of contradictions, that's just part of, having a bigger conversation about this stuff, is car culture. Here in Southern California, we got some car culture, for anyone who hasn't noticed. And I'm someone who, for a number of years lived car free in LA, had a very strong identity around, the fact that we have this massive transportation system, massive public transportation system. You can actually bike pretty well in LA if you know how to get around. All those possibilities, to me, are this wonderful alternative to what the car symbolizes, which is violence and extraction, blah, blah, blah. Well, for a lot of people in this region, the car doesn't represent those things. Actually, waiting for the bus represents those things, or having to ride a bike represents those things. And so, what I've been working on accepting for the last few years is car culture is going to be part of where we're going in the future. And what are the ways that we can actually partner with people who have a strong identity rooted in car culture, and celebrate with them the positive aspects. So that could be things like including car clubs, like lowrider clubs, in what we're talking about with sustainable transportation. That could mean, I don't know how we would do this, but like somehow, finding out what are the priorities of the people who really believe in like the fast and furious lifestyle, because that's a real phenomenon where I live in LA. I mean, sports cars and drag racing, unfortunately, are part of the landscape. Like, you see the tire marks where people have been doing donuts in intersections overnight. Are those people part of our sustainable future? I think they are. How the hell do we actually make inroads so that we're having a conversation with more of our communities, as opposed to planning on their behalf and saying, we got to get away from all that stuff. So yeah, I do think it's super complicated. I think that what we laid out in the 1.0 principles was definitely visionary. And I think that the getting toward something that's more inclusive and participatory is going to include grappling with these realities of racialized wealth inequality and lack of access to opportunity, mass incarceration. I think, it's we put together those principles over the course of 2016 and 2017. And then the world has changed a lot since then. We basically released those principles a year into Trump's term. And look at where we are now. Look at all that happened in 2020. I think that a lot of us are, kind of like Hannah was saying, that the framework Greenlining is presenting isn't just specific to mobility. We need to be part of this bigger cultural shift that's happening. And I'm really glad that that so many people are seeing the resonance between the liberation work that Black Lives Matter has led and symbolized so much in recent years with how we do transportation and mobility work. There's so many ways that transportation and mobility are part of how people have been oppressed and how people can be liberated. And I think we need to be open to the fact that those ways may not look like Copenhagen, may not look like a bicycle traffic signal, may not look like a particular bike share model. We don't know because we have been living in a segregated society. We don't know what the best ideas are. So just kind of being open to that and recognizing, that who's in the position to judge? Who am I the person who should be saying, somebody's relationship to an automobile is wrong or bad and not part of the future? I don't know. I don't feel like I really have that platform to be judging from.
Yeah, I think the entire premise of the mobility justice framework was really about centering the people, and kind of going back to where we started, centering communities and people, especially people who have been really left out of these conversations, these spaces, and and extracted from, and recentering, right, around our communities, and away from the notion of modality and like which modality is superior and which is inferior, and those judgments that are cast. I mean, we were kind of coming out of spaces where there were real judgments that were cast. And so what does it mean, again, in a just transition to move from that? Because we came from that. I mean, if we're really going to be real about it, the transportation, like we've gone through different modality sort of like superiority like it was at one point, cities were places for walking, communities were places for walking, and then it was, no, it's about automobiles, and now there's a shift back, and so we've cast modalities and others, and those modalities have people that are using them, and so let's not do that again and again and again, right? And so I do want to finally like talk about, because we're starting to talk about like accountability and roles and responsibilities. And so given that I have worked inside of a city, I'm now working on in the private sector side, I really do think a lot about, what is it that institutions, corporations, like what are the different roles, what are the different responsibilities, and what does it mean, right, for a just transition? I mean, if we're really going to talk about a New Deal, we have to talk about a just transition. If we're going to talk about mobility justice, we have to talk about a just transition. And so what does that actually mean, right? Like for institutions and within institutions, right? What has to be there? What are the sort of tangible changes that need to occur? And I think, starting to see that, definitely, I think this year with COVID or I should say last year with COVID and the murder of George Floyd, while it was not an aha moment for many of us, it was an aha moment for a number of folks in leadership positions inside of institutions that didn't actually see the relationships for many, many, many years, even while there was a conversation within, our spheres around mobility justice and transportation equity. I think it's really started to take hold inside of institutions. And so I think a lot about the role, right? And I am curious what you all think the roles and responsibilities ought to be. I think they have been sort of cast as like government, regulatory, and corporations and companies are partners, and then there's community, but community provides input, but it's like, what does it mean in a just transition to start to maybe flip some of those roles? I'm just curious what you all think.
Yeah, similarly, I am so thrilled about how all sectors have come on equity, right? But I think it's so important to remember that like we're just getting started. And I think a just transition within institutions means that we all have to constantly be moving the goalposts forward across sectors. Like even at Greenlining, we're constantly redefining our definition of equity, redoing our entire organization's vision and mission to better reflect the times, right? There really is no end point for equity. And so in our equity evaluation methodology, we wanted to create a tool that reflects that, because we know that, of course, not everyone is an equity expert, and we want to guide folks in a helpful way. And so those 6 standards for equitable investment that I mentioned earlier, those are super complex and multifaceted. We know that. And there's many different ways, and approaches to adhere to them, depending on where an entity is starting from. And we were beginning to observe this in our relationships with many different sectors, many different government players, where we're like, okay, this agency, like they're kind of like maybe at a 101. This one maybe more like a 201, right? And so we can't expect everyone to be starting from the same place. So therefore, we decided to note a difference between a minimum and a transformative equity approach. I think the most simple way I could describe it is a minimum approach is kind of like the basic essential building blocks of equity policies and programs. Transformative approaches are definitely more innovative, they're more revolutionary, but those are the ones that really will shift power and transform the system that created the injustices in the first place. So just to make this a bit more tangible, for example, on how to make a clean mobility equity program more community driven. Now, conducting a needs assessment is an important first step, but that's also kind of like the bare minimum equity approach, right? You have to keep building onto that from there. Now, the next would be building in community decision-making from start to finish. That's definitely getting us closer to a transformative equity approach. And again, in our playbook, there's a ton of real life examples of these community owned and operated, kinds of, just for example, electric vehicle car sharing in rural areas, where residents actually are the ones who sit on the board. They make their decisions about how the service should operate. So just to kind of wrap this up, put another way, minimum equity approaches, again, are the starting point. They're kind of commonly seen in programs as like those early stages of introducing equity. They often focus on reducing harm, but they really can be essential in supporting the creation and kind of growth of those more transformative approaches. Transformative approaches absolutely are more challenging. They will require significant investments in time, political buy-in, and willpower. But I would say that, the process, again, of shifting this community power to communities, that also requires building trust. It requires investing sufficient resources really to make this whole process work. So for each of those 6 standards for equitable investment, we provide a wide array of those equity approaches to adhere to them. And then we kind of rank them on a gradient of sorts from a minimum to a transformative approach to kind of illustrate that growth over time. So all that to say is that a just transition within institutions absolutely takes time. It takes kind of like knowing, your strengths, your gaps, where you need to go from there. It definitely requires equity champions within who are going to push for conducting an internal equity assessment as a first step, hiring the right people, asking really hard questions, and pushing for so much more, transformative approaches and just like a totally different way of doing things.
I want to just hop in and this distinction that you're talking about, Hannah, is so useful. That's built into that model of, kind of like a baseline building blocks versus transformative. And it makes me think about this aspect of cultural shift that I feel like I've been witnessing in the last few years where, and this kind of relates to within the sustainable transportation field, running up against this mid 20th century infrastructure model that we know is really destructive. We are in this time, right, where I see lots of like media narratives around a divided country. This is a divided country. And that really bothers me because it is referring to a disagreement among white people, that white people are arguing with each other. And I actually think it's a good thing that white people are arguing with each other. And so I wonder, I'm kind of thinking like that's a sort of, incremental approach might be, yeah, the battle is between Democrats and Republicans. The battle is between bikes and cars. But a more transformative approach is getting rid of that binary thinking and saying, actually, there's a whole world of possibilities that people who are coming from these different kinds of experiences and relationships to the world can be bringing into the conversation. And so, from my perspective, we're actually in a time of greater unity than I've ever witnessed. I'm a Mexican American mixed race woman who grew up in a segregated community where white residents in the town where I'm from referred to my neighborhood as the ghetto because it had Mexican immigrant families. And this was a place with landscaping and pools. These were like nice condos, but it was the ghetto because Mexicans lived there. This was my experience in the 80s and 90s. And here we are today. I think in a lot of parts of the country, maybe it's different. I'm sure there are still places where, we're dealing with that. But we have to get beyond this idea that there's one kind of conflict or one kind of disagreement. There's one kind of us versus them. And I personally just would really love to see more of a discussion about the collective that's expanding as opposed to this conflict between white men that if we keep feeding it, it's just going to go on forever. And and it really doesn't serve most of us. And so where I see that fitting into the conversation about like doing this kind of shift within government is government is a partisan space, right? So I don't know. As someone who's never worked in the public sector, I've worked in nonprofits and academia, but I've talked to lots of people who work in the public sector. I feel like the power struggle there is really different from the power struggle of is the community going to have a voice or is the private sector going to have a voice? It's a power struggle about well, I'm in the legacy of this elected official or this kingmaker, and and that's how power goes. And here in Los Angeles, we're going through, I hope, a positive time of transformation as Eric Garcetti moves from being our mayor to having a different role somewhere else, and creating an opportunity to maybe shift some of the ways that people can get stuck in lies. Basically, I mean, there's a cover up that's been revealed around Garcetti and folks on his staff enabling a sexual harasser to just keep doing his thing while denying that they were doing that kind of cover up. So anyway, long-winded. I just want to really point to the fact that transformative opens up a greater opportunity to see the other kinds of realities and the other kinds of possibilities that are already happening, and get us away from that really stuck feeling binary of a divided country, we got to be stuck in some sort of like Civil War or Cold War mentality where there's two superpowers. I don't think two superpowers really describes the world. So I'll just stop there.
Well, thanks. I think what I'm taking away and what I'm hearing, which so much there, but I think there's sort of this role in which our institutions, whether government, whether inside of the private sector, whether we're talking about nonprofits, right, and advocacy or philanthropy, there's power and power structures that are built on racial hierarchies that need to be really not only assessed, but addressed and then dismantled. And that we also need to understand that the binaries that are sometimes created are unfortunate ways of distracting from like root cause issues. And so like there is a real role and responsibility to understand the historical aspects of how power consolidates, who gets to be in power, and also to start really relinquishing and redistributing that power, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about in terms of a just transition, where communities are really, seated in roles where they're helping to really direct like what it is that they need. And so that requires a ton of change management, which is like a, flashy term for like, you got to do better. And I think that the way that Hannah has laid out, sort of baseline to transformative processes that can support that kind of change management is really helpful. So we use a similar framework. Government Alliance for Race and Equity has a similar framework. I think these tools are really helpful. They are not simple processes. They do require time, they do require resources, and they do require a real commitment to really, dismantling, right, like existing structures that have created these kinds of outcomes. So, so I think that's what I'm hearing. But I want to know, because we've got a few more minutes, to really hear how the audience thinks they fit into a just transition, whatever role you're in, whatever space you occupy. What is it that you see as your role and your responsibility, and how can you and will you contribute to a just transition? What does it mean? Loaded questions. So you can either, I think, put them in your chat. I don't know that you have the ability to just jump in, unfortunately. I think, don't know who wrote this comment, but it says, wouldn't it be great if every transportation plan started with a power analysis? Who wrote that? Zoom is a funny place. I can't actually talk to anyone. Yes, it would be great. It would be, I think, really critical. That was Benji chiming in. Yeah, mapping power is, I think, a really important part of understanding, how and what justice and where power lives, and true power, not just hierarchical power. Any questions populating? Also, if anybody here, I mean, Hannah and Adonia, if you all have questions or additional topics you want to discuss, we can certainly.
I think I did see a question in the chat. Is there a cultural approach to shifting our transportation systems? Should there be one? That's a really great question. And, I think on so many levels, yes. And I keep coming back to this. I think this is like a common theme I'm hearing here. We need a cultural shift in government and mobility companies giving up power and the traditional way that we've always done things. And instead, create more meaningful processes where communities can decide which mobility options work best for them. And they can weigh in on, decisions around how mobility options operate, where they should operate. But again, that's not to say that communities have to be alone in this effort. In our Clean Mobility Equity Playbook, our evaluation found that the most successful clean mobility programs were actually the ones that had really strong partnerships between cities, communities, and sometimes mobility companies. But absolutely, this requires kind of a cultural shift in building trust and building equitable partnerships.
I would say too, in terms of cultural shift, one of the ways that I got started in working on transportation was helping to create an open street event here in Los Angeles called Ciclavia. And our vision for that was to be a catalyst in terms of, knowing that there was a sort of pent up demand for having more bikeable, walkable streets. And so by temporarily creating a space where people could participate in that without having to, feel like a rebel or, like they were breaking a rule, that maybe we could see some shift. But I definitely think, while that event is fantastic and wonderful and beautiful, and, has been around for 10 years now, which is rad, it also is a politically owned event in the sense that it's something that moves around to different districts and you know, is a press opportunity for city council members and things like that. And so I do think that figuring out what kinds of what are the things, what are the pathways we're going to open up? Because you can do really cool interventions, so many cool interventions with public space, you know, creating pop-ups, you know, changing things around. But what are we doing from there? Because those on their own are not actually going to, you know, change our government cultures or how we, you know, create paid opportunities for people to start being part of the planning process. So I think thinking beyond, you know, what happens after the pop-up, what happens after the, you know, really fun workshop, what happens after the open street event is important. And the other thing I wanted to say about that is, you know, we have so many opportunities to engage with what culture shift means right now, not only in terms of our street transportation choices, right, but also in terms of how we are signaling participation or allyship with liberation movements that are happening. And I think one really big opportunity we have that I would so love to see some action in is really looking at, you know, our enforcement system, not just enforcement, our traffic laws, right? Like we expect traffic laws to govern our streets and keep us safe. Well, the people who enforce those laws are problematic in terms of the you know, abuse of power that is often fatal that has happened to Black communities, Indigenous communities, Brown communities with over policing. So I really feel like what I'm witnessing in streets in Los Angeles is a lack of buy-in in the traffic law system. I think that we have a lot of people for whom any system that is upheld by police is something that doesn't ring true for them and that they don't feel, you know, they need to be beholden to. So when I see someone run a red light, when I see someone, you know, act in a way that from my, you know, sustainable transportation perspective is really toxic, I wonder, is that someone who is saying, I am not going to participate, this system is not going to hold me back. This system was designed, like many systems, to hold me back because of the color of my skin, and I'm not going to be held back by it. So I think we have some serious reckoning to do around how our traffic laws sound like, smell like, feel like other unfair systems of law that are holding communities back. I think we actually need to go back to, you know, saying where do these laws come from? What are they trying to achieve? What are some alternatives? What are ways that we can keep each other safe that maybe we can get more buy-in around? Because, you know, it really seems to me that our system is not working as well as maybe it could.
Well, I see Benji has rejoined us, which means, I know what this means. Our time is coming to its conclusion, but there's so many awesome questions that have like populated, and I just want to say thanks for grappling and engaging and for formulating these questions, because I think that's part of the work. And there's no way that we would have all of the answers for these questions because we just don't. I think that was part of the purpose of this conversation, was really to really grapple with what does it mean to think about and to have a just transition in the context of transportation. So thank you for raising these questions and for thinking with us and for being a part of the dialogue. And with that, Benji, I'll turn it over to you.
Naomi, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Lugo and Hannah, for just such an amazing conversation. And I think that the idea of, we tend to think of infrastructure as neutral and we're expert decision makers. And it's like there are power decisions behind that. And I think the other thing that I take away from it is, right, despite the emergency, right, the climate crisis emergency, that we can't just be prescriptive and say, that's the solution, we need to listen, right? Because we need to take people along with us and we need to understand their needs. So this is just amazing. Thank you so much.